There's an endless amount of inviting paths to explore through the Tulgey Wood, and in this one we'll emerge from a shadowy hollow to find a path marked with glowing lanterns. Like always, we'll begin with the background, and we'll do this with a rough blend of phthalo green, Prussian blue, primary yellow and white. Any old mixture of these colours will work, and you can use a wide flat brush to paint these colours in roughly overlapping strokes. We don't need to paint the whole page, so we can leave a bit of bare page all around the outside. And once you've applied some different shades of greens and green blues, use a mostly dry brush to blur those colours together. I use the brush in all different angles when I do this, and with only short strokes. That way we don't have the paint moving around too much, and it just mixes together a little where the different colours overlap. It's better to work too dry doing this than too wet, and your brush will let you know when you need a little extra moisture, because the dry bristles will begin to clump together and you'll get lines when you're trying to blend. When this occurs, wet the brush and blot dry well on a paper towel to reset those bristles before carrying on with the blending. I have the background covered here, but I want a little extra light in this top right, and we can just pop a few blobs of white over the top for this. It looks kind of funny at first, but clean and dry your brush and then blend this in the same way that you did the background. White reactivates really easily, so pay attention to not spread this colour around the whole of the background, so use those nice small blending strokes again. Now let's paint the shadowy hollow that'll make up the foreground of our scene, and we'll do this with a nice dark mixture, so phthalo green and Prussian blue. Keep this mix free of white for the most intense dark colour. Use your wide flat brush to fill in the remaining bare page and to create a tidy but irregular line around the edge of the opening, just overlapping the background that you've painted. At the bottom of the page, we can use a little white and a round brush to create our pathway. Do this with horizontal brush strokes and let the white blend with the darker colour underneath to create a subtly lighter path. Let this extend a little into the background and down to the bottom of the page, and make it wider in the foreground and narrower in the distance to show the perspective. Now, our main details in this scene will be the foreground opening, but we do want some things going on in the background to make it a little interesting. But we'll keep these details softer and more subtle. Mix a dusty blue, this is Prussian blue, a little phthalo green and white, and use your round brush to add a few bush shapes either side of the path. Make the top edge nice and irregular and bumpy like a bush would be, and then paint this colour down to the foreground silhouette. Either side of the pathway here at the bottom, let's blur the harsh line away a little. You can use a dark mixture with just a little white added and kind of fuss here until the harsh line disappears. I did this with small rounded motions, so any marks that I left would just look like more little plants or leafy clumps. Above our background bushes, let's add some trees, and we want that same dusty blue here for a colour that's just a little darker than the background. Use your round and liner brushes to paint a nice mixture of tree silhouettes. I like to pop in the trunks and larger branches with the round brush, and then grab the liner to add some smaller, more delicate outer limbs. Now with our background in place, we can switch to the foreground, and here we'll begin with making this harsh silhouette a little more interesting. We'll do this with the same colour, and we can grab our round brush and begin to add some plants and vines and things growing around the opening. We also want to make sure that we add a nice crooked spiral branch to hook our lantern onto over here on the left. For the vines, I'm just adding some that are kind of twined together, maybe different thicknesses, and then some that are just hanging down. You can also add little leaves to your vines, and I like to make these just irregular little swipes of the brush so that they don't look too samey. With our foreground silhouettes in place, let's paint the lanterns. We're going to add one hanging from our spiral branch and one on the side of the path in the distance. And we're going to start by marking in the location with a little white. Now there's two ways to go about this. I'm going to quickly outline both of your options here. The first is to use a little white gouache as an isolation layer. This is what you'll see me do in this tutorial. The white goes on over the background colours, and then the yellows that we add over the top mix with the white rather than the blues and the greens underneath. The other way you could do this is exactly the same, but before you add any paint to the page, you can wet the paint that's already where you're going to paint the lantern and use a piece of tissue to blot that reactivated paint off the page. This would be especially important if you have a few layers on the page already that's getting quite thick, or if there was a bold colour underneath that's likely to mix and make unwanted colours when you add the yellow. So keep this extra step in mind if you think it might apply to you. Now for the glow of these lanterns, I want a really rich warm orange, and it just so happens that this little tube of gamboge is perfect. I've had this colour for so long and you can see how much of it I've used, barely any. That's because if you already have yellow and red on your palette, you can just mix this colour. And I'm only really using it here because I don't have any red out. And if I have to dispense an extra colour, well, it might as well be exactly what I want. I'm going to give this colour a bump in opacity with a little extra white. We'll be applying it in a few layers to build the brightness, so don't worry about it looking perfect straight away. I've grabbed my liner for this. It means I don't have anywhere in the brush for extra moisture to hide, and I'm less likely to over fuss. I can just apply the orange and move on. So we're going to go for a glow that's nice and orange around the outside, but still white and bright in the center. So add your paint a little at a time, and it's really important to let it dry between the layers. We can darken the glow at the outer edge by mixing a little brown with the orange for a deeper tone. Here I've used a touch of burnt sienna for convenience, but if you don't have this, you'll want to mix a brown from primary red plus yellow to make orange, and then darkened with a touch of blue. Whenever I find the paint hasn't quite dried and is still a little sensitive to unintentional mixing, you can cheat a little by adding the colour in spots rather than brush strokes. But even if you do this because you're super impatient like me, at some point you do still have to let it dry before you can blend it all together. Around the outside edge of our lanterns, we can create a little glow with a bright yellow green. This is primary yellow and phthalo green and a tiny touch of white. We don't need much of this, and we don't need to create an opaque layer of colour either. Just use your liner to paint this around your lanterns, and then go back with a clean damp brush and fuss at the outer edge of the green to blend it into the background, like you would blur the outer edge of a firefly. The little bit of time spent doing this has let my lanterns dry, so I'm popping another layer of orange on top. While we wait for that to dry, we can take our liner and the dark blue colour to paint a little crook for the other lantern to hang from, letting the base disappear into the bushes here. And I've added a little bright line down this stand where it passes the light, just a tiny touch of white. If your lanterns are dry, we can go ahead and add the final pop of white to the bright center, blending this out into the surrounding orange. Now let's add some illuminated green details, and these will be phthalo green and primary yellow for like a mid-green colour. And we can paint some plants around the opening with this. I've grabbed the round petal brush for convenience, but you can use a round brush for larger shapes and a liner for more delicate details. A combination of leafy shapes, little bumpy bushes, and taller grasses is perfect here, so feel free to paint similar shapes to these or to include different ones. We also want to show the few plants growing out of the shadows either side, so here on the right I've roughly gone over one of the darker silhouettes. And then I've added some little leafy things growing up the wall here on the left. To balance out the larger plants on the right, I'm going to add some palm fronds here on the left, and these begin with a long thin stroke for the center and then a bunch of smaller leaves either side. Because of how much this colour lightens as it dries, you can't really see the shape all that great just yet, but when I paint this type of plant, I like to let some of the individual leaves cross over each other for a more natural look. Underneath this, we can add some bumpy bushes and grasses, but I'm making sure to keep the majority of the plants away from that darker outer edge of the scene. And I think we'll pop a bit of green on a few of these things hanging down from above. Again, just rough little blobs on a couple of the plant shapes, and a little on the moss hanging from the vines. Because this colour is so bold against the dark, we need to blend the bottom edge in a little, and we can just use a damp brush to fuss away this line into the darker background. Now it's going to look dark almost immediately, but don't be alarmed, that yellow will brighten up again as it dries. So I recommend doing a little blending and then letting it dry to see if it needs any extra in areas. We have this bright green, but let's add a more subtle shadowy colour to show where the plants are disappearing off into the shadows. So this is phthalo green and Prussian blue plus a little white, so it stands out on that dark background. And we can pop a little bit of this next to the other plants or wherever we want to create that suggestion of plants kind of hiding in the gloom. So we have all that lovely warm orange light and these bright plants, but let's enhance this light effect with a few thoughtful highlights. And for this, we want that same colour that we added around the lanterns. So primary yellow, a little phthalo green and white. Use your round or liner brush to swipe a little bit of this colour across the tops of some of your plants. Here I added it to the larger leaves and down some of the palm fronds. You can enhance a few blades of grass and pick out some of the greenery around the opening with this too. But we don't want to go crazy with this colour or it loses its effect. I added a touch more white to this mixture and highlighted these brightest areas once more with just a few tiny brush strokes. Every time we do this, where you lighten a colour to add highlights, think about not covering more than 5 or 10% of the previous colour for the best results. So the brighter the marks, the fewer of them there should be. So once we have all of these different bright marks, we can take a moment to blend a few of them in a little. And I do this with just a touch of a clean damp brush, just a quick swipe to soften a mark here and there. It stops it from looking kind of like methodical, like I've added the colours up in layers, which of course is what we've done. We kind of get a little bit of natural variation by doing this. We have all this lovely illumination on the plants, so let's add just a little to the hollow itself, and I'm going to use a little brown for that. This is the burnt sienna, but like earlier, you can mix a little brown from your primaries if you don't have this option. So this brown has a touch of white added to lift the value, and I'm going to start by painting it in all of the places that will be getting a little light. So the spiral branch, the sides of the hollow, and maybe some of the vines. Then you can add a little more white to the mix and just pick out the brightest edges with a few careful lines. And just like the layers of green, each time we do this and get a little bit brighter, these marks are going to be smaller, until the brightest mix is just capturing the very edge of the light. I used a dark orange to add a loop to the top of the lanterns, attaching them onto the branch and the crook with a tiny little hooked line. And I used some of the dark blue mixture to darken up the bottom right and left corners of the scene. I also added an extra sprinkle of pale grasses along the ground either side of the path, just a light green and the liner brush for these. I wanted a little bit of mysterious light peeping from the background, so I used some white gouache to paint the areas between a few of the trees, and then blended this colour up into the background. I only do this where the shapes aren't too fussy, like between simple trunks. Don't worry about it around small fussy branches. I added a sprinkle of tiny white dots around the lanterns with the tip of the liner brush to amp up the magical sparkle, and also tucked a few along the edge of the path. The very final thing we'll do to this scene is to add just a little primary yellow. This is a semi-transparent colour, so we can glaze it over the top of the other colours for that extra pop of warmth. I added a touch to the closest plants to the lanterns, and a little swipe over the illuminated trunk on the left too. I didn't want to neglect the light around the distant lantern, so I added a few rough illuminated bushes, just with that little bit of primary yellow and letting it mix into the colours underneath, and I applied it with a small rounded motions to create that lumpy bush effect. And I think at that our magical little hollow is complete.